It started as just another quiet evening for Daniel, sitting at his desk with his laptop glowing in the dark. He often spent nights searching the internet for strange places and forgotten things. His small YouTube channel had a few loyal followers who loved the kind of real-world mysteries he explored. Old houses, hidden tunnels, and ghost towns, he had seen them all. But that night something new caught his eye. It was a strange post on a small online forum titled, "Cruise Ship in the Forest." The words were odd enough to stop him from scrolling past. The post was short and clumsy, written by someone claiming they had seen a huge ship deep in the woods of northern Canada while hunting. Most comments were jokes. Some people laughed, saying it was fake or an edited picture. Yet one blurry photo was attached, and that changed everything for Daniel. The picture wasn't clear, but he could make out a large white structure, curved like the front of a ship surrounded by trees. It didn't make sense. A cruise ship in a forest? How could that even happen? He zoomed in on the image again and again, trying to spot details. The metal looked aged, rusting, and covered in green vines. The shape was unmistakable, a ship's bow. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. He'd seen many fake photos before, but this one didn't feel like that. Something about it seemed genuine. He spent the next few hours searching online for any story that might explain it. He typed every keyword he could think of. Abandoned ship in forest, lost cruise liner Canada, ship stranded inland. There were a few articles about shipwrecks, but nothing that matched this. That made it even more interesting. By the time he looked at the clock, it was past 2 a.m. His coffee was cold and his eyes were sore, yet his mind was racing. He opened his map app, trying to guess where such a thing could exist. The photo background hinted at tall pine trees, maybe somewhere north, possibly near a river that had long dried up. He remembered hearing stories about major floods decades ago that had changed river paths. Could a flood have carried a ship inland and left it there? The thought sounded wild, but that was what made it so tempting. For the next few days, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. He kept looking at satellite maps, comparing old routes of rivers and lakes. He watched weather records, flood maps, and even old government documents that mentioned shipping accidents. Then he found something that made his heart jump. There had been a major flood in 1986 that changed the course of a river in the northern part of the country. It had caused serious damage and stranded several transport vessels inland. None of the reports mentioned a cruise ship, though. Still, that was enough to convince him he had to see it for himself. He shared the photo with a few friends who often helped him on his exploring trips. They laughed at first. "A cruise ship in the woods? Come on, man," one of them said. "Someone's pranking you." Another friend said, "Even if it's real, it's probably too deep in the forest. You won't find it." Daniel smiled and shrugged. He'd heard that before, people doubting the impossible. Yet deep down he felt this one was different. He wasn't chasing a myth for views. He genuinely wanted to know the truth. That weekend he started gathering his gear. His small backpack, drone, flashlight, camera, camping stove, and extra batteries went in first. He had done many solo trips before, so the idea of going alone didn't bother him. He double-checked the drone batteries, formatted the SD cards, and wrote down coordinates based on where he thought the location might be. The journey wouldn't be easy. The area was remote with no clear roads, but that was exactly the kind of challenge that excited him. On a calm morning, he loaded his things into his old pickup truck and set out before sunrise. The road stretched endlessly through valleys and tall pine forests, with no sign of people for hours. The further he drove, the rougher the path became. Eventually, the paved road turned to dirt, then to a narrow trail that twisted between thick trees. He followed his map carefully, stopping once in a while to check his compass. As the daylight grew stronger, he noticed how untouched everything felt. The forest seemed endless, like it hadn't seen humans in years. He parked when the path finally ended and continued on foot. Each step made the ground crunch under his boots. His backpack felt heavier than usual, but his excitement kept him going. After walking for hours, he stopped to rest near a stream. He filled his bottle, sat on a rock, and listened to the quiet. It was the kind of silence that only deep forest had. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. For a few moments, he wondered if he was chasing nothing, just a trick of the internet. Then he remembered the photo again, the rust, the shape, the mystery, and felt the rush return. By late afternoon, Daniel noticed something odd. Near the base of a hill, a large metal piece was sticking out from the ground. He brushed off the dirt and moss and realized it was an old chain, thick and rusted, attached to something buried. A few feet away, another piece of metal appeared, then what looked like an anchor, half hidden under years of soil and leaves. His hands trembled slightly as he uncovered more of it. It was real metal, heavy and weathered. That couldn't just be coincidence. It meant there had been something big here long ago. His heartbeat quickened. He took out his camera and filmed the area, talking softly into the lens, explaining what he had found. His voice had that mix of disbelief and excitement that came from discovering something truly unexpected. The sun was dropping fast, and shadows stretched across the forest floor. Daniel decided to camp nearby for the night. He found a flat spot near the stream, set up his tent, and lit a small campfire. As he ate a simple meal, he kept glancing at the dark trees beyond the firelight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was close, maybe only a few miles away from the ship, if it really existed. The night grew colder, and the forest came alive with faint sounds, leaves rustling, distant owls calling, the soft splash of water nearby. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, replaying the whole day in his mind. That rusty chain had to mean something. Ships had anchors. Ships had chains. Maybe he wasn't crazy after all. Before falling asleep, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I'll find it." The next morning, he woke up early, packed quickly, and started walking again. The air was thick with fog, wrapping the trees in a soft gray mist. It was quiet, except for the sound of his boots and the occasional bird call. Every few minutes, he checked his map, adjusting his direction slightly. The terrain was rough. Fallen branches, slippery rocks, and sudden drops that forced him to move slowly. At one point, he stopped to catch his breath and looked around. The forest seemed endless, almost intimidating. For the first time, a bit of doubt crept in. What if he'd misread the map? What if that picture had been faked after all? Still, he knew turning back now would haunt him. He had come too far to stop. He decided to send his drone up for a quick scan. Setting it on the ground, he powered it on and watched it lift silently into the air. The live feed on his phone showed an ocean of green treetops stretching as far as the eye could see. He moved the drone forward slowly, scanning the area. Nothing at first. Then, just as he was about to bring it back, something flashed on the screen. A pale shape, faint but large, breaking the uniform green. His hands froze. He zoomed in, and there it was again, something big, white, and oddly curved. His chest tightened with excitement. He recorded the footage, lowering the drone just enough to get a clearer view. The image shook slightly from wind, but the outline was undeniable. It looked like the top deck of a ship peeking out through the trees. Daniel's voice trembled as he spoke into his camera. I think I just found it." He brought the drone back, packed quickly, and began moving toward the direction it had shown. The forest was thick and progress was slow, but every step now had purpose. The feeling of discovery drove him forward. He no longer felt tired or cold. He just wanted to see it with his own eyes. By evening, the fog started to lift, revealing streaks of sunlight through the trees. He could smell the faint scent of rust in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable. He stopped listening. Everything around him was silent again, like the forest itself was waiting. He smiled to himself and whispered, almost in disbelief, "It's real. It has to be." That night, he didn't sleep much. He lay awake in his tent, knowing that somewhere close, hidden by the trees, an enormous ship was waiting. The mystery that had started with a random post on a forgotten forum had led him deep into the unknown. Tomorrow he would finally see what no one believed existed. The morning light crept through the tent, and Daniel opened his eyes before the sun was fully up. The forest was quiet again, that same deep kind of silence that felt heavy and endless. He packed his things quickly, barely eating breakfast. His mind was fixed on the direction his drone had shown the day before. Somewhere beyond the thick trees and uneven ground, the shape he had seen waited for him. He adjusted his backpack and started walking. The air was cool, carrying the smell of wet soil and pine. Every now and then he'd stop to listen, making sure he was heading the right way. The trees grew denser, the roots twisting like ropes under his boots. He kept glancing at his compass, comparing it to the coordinates he had saved on his phone. He was close now. Hours passed, and the terrain became rougher. Fallen logs blocked his path, and thick bushes scratched at his clothes. He used a small machete to clear his way, careful not to lose his sense of direction. At one point, the ground dipped into a shallow valley where the air felt damp and cooler. He noticed something strange. The deeper he went, the fewer sounds there were. No birds, no wind rustling the branches. Just stillness. He paused to take a drink from his bottle. His arms were sore and sweat ran down the back of his neck. He looked up at the sky through the trees. It was gray with clouds moving in slowly. He knew he had only a few hours before it might rain. That gave him even more reason to move faster. As he climbed a small ridge, his foot caught on something metallic buried beneath leaves. He bent down and brushed the dirt away. It was a chunk of rusted steel, curved slightly. He ran his hand over it and his heart skipped a beat. The shape was too smooth and uniform to be natural. It had to be part of something man-made. He started finding more pieces as he moved forward. Small fragments of metal, a cracked pipe, even what looked like a railing twisted out of shape. Each new discovery pulled him deeper into the forest, step by step. The smell of rust grew stronger. Then, without warning, the trees began to thin. Daniel pushed through the last line of bushes and froze. Before him stood something massive, something that made him forget how to breathe for a second. Rising above the treetops was the hull of a ship, a real enormous ship. Its white paint was peeling and streaked with rust, but the shape was unmistakable. The bow pointed slightly upward, almost proud, as if defying time itself. Trees had grown around it, wrapping their roots into the metal sides like they were trying to hold it down. Daniel just stood there, staring. His camera hung forgotten around his neck. It looked like a dream, a strange mix of beauty and decay. The sunlight broke through the clouds for a moment, casting a soft glow across the ship's surface. The forest was quiet except for the faint creak of branches swaying above. He finally raised his camera and began to film, speaking softly as he moved closer. His voice shook a little from excitement. It's real, he said. It's actually here. The ground near the ship was uneven, with patches of moss and broken wood scattered everywhere. He circled slowly, keeping the lens steady. Up close, the ship looked even larger. It was tilted slightly to one side, resting on its hull, as if it had run aground long ago and never moved again. He walked toward what used to be the lower deck. The doorway was half covered in vines, but the structure seemed stable enough to climb. He set down his backpack, took out his flashlight, and tested the metal steps with one foot. They groaned under his weight but held firm. Step by step, he pulled himself up and entered through the opening. Inside, the air was thick and smelled of rust and wet wood. The light from his flashlight danced across walls covered in peeling paint and moss. He could see rows of cabins, doors half open, furniture collapsed under years of decay. He spoke quietly to his camera again. "It feels like time just stopped here," he said. "Like everyone left in a hurry." He walked slowly down the corridor, brushing aside spider webs. Water dripped from somewhere above, echoing softly. His flashlight beam caught something on the wall, a faded sign with letters barely visible. He wiped off the grime and squinted. It read, "Dining Hall." Curiosity pushed him forward. The dining area was wide, with long tables scattered and broken chairs piled in one corner. A few plates still sat on the tables covered in dust. Some of the windows were shattered, letting in streaks of sunlight that illuminated the particles floating in the air. The silence was haunting yet peaceful. Daniel took out his camera again and filmed slowly, capturing every detail. He spoke in a low tone, almost whispering to himself. "Imagine all the people who once sat here. Music, laughter, food, and now nothing." He stopped near a window, looking out. The view was surreal, the forest stretching endlessly around the ship, trees growing right up to its hull. Birds occasionally flew past, but otherwise it was just stillness. He sat on a broken chair, catching his breath. It was overwhelming. He had found what most people thought was just a myth. His hands were shaking slightly as he replayed the footage on his camera, checking that everything had recorded properly. After a few minutes, he decided to explore further. He climbed a narrow staircase that led to the upper deck. The steps creaked under his weight, but they held. When he reached the top, the sight took his breath away again. The entire deck was covered in moss and small plants, as if the forest had claimed it as part of itself. The railings were bent and rusted, yet parts of them still stood strong. He walked to the edge and looked down. The ship stretched for what felt like forever, disappearing into the trees below. It was hard to imagine how such a massive vessel had ended up here, miles from any ocean. He ran his fingers along the railing, feeling the rough texture of time. Suddenly, he noticed something strange, a small metal plate near the railing half hidden under dirt. He crouched down and cleaned it with his hand. The letters were faded, but he could still make out the name of the ship. He said it aloud softly, almost as if speaking to a ghost. The Northern Star. He wrote the name down in his notebook. Maybe that would help him later when he searched for its history. He wondered if anyone even remembered this ship, or the people who once worked on it. The clouds above began to darken, and a cool wind swept across the deck. It was time to head back to camp before the rain came. He carefully made his way down, filming bits of the interior one last time. In one of the corridors, he spotted something that made him pause, an old framed picture hanging crookedly on the wall. It showed a smiling crew standing on the same deck he had just walked across. The glass was cracked and the faces were faded, but it was still there, untouched. He stared at it for a long moment. Somehow that picture made the whole discovery feel more personal, more human. These weren't just stories or rumors. Real people had been here once, living, laughing, working. He whispered quietly, "I'll tell your story." The rain began softly as he stepped outside. The sound of drops hitting the metal surface echoed through the forest. He found shelter under a large tree near the hull and watched the rain fall, lost in thought. The ship looked even more surreal now, mist curling around it like a veil. He spent that night at his camp just a short distance away. The rain tapped gently on his tent while he reviewed the day's footage. His video showed every angle of the ship, every shadowed hallway, every broken chair. He felt a mix of pride and disbelief. He had done it, found something no one else had. Still, one question wouldn't leave his mind. How had it gotten there? The next morning, he woke up with that thought still lingering. The rain had stopped and the air was fresh. He decided he would go back inside the ship again, this time exploring deeper. Maybe the control room or the engine deck would have clues. He packed lightly, keeping only his flashlight, notebook, and camera. As he stood before the ship once more, he felt a strange mix of excitement and reverence. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a piece of history lying quietly in the woods, waiting for someone to listen. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Let's see what secrets you've been keeping." Then he stepped inside once again, ready to uncover the truth behind the forgotten Northern Star. The morning light was soft and golden when Daniel returned to the ship. Dew covered the ground and the forest smelled fresh after the rain. The air felt calm, almost peaceful, yet there was still that strange pull he couldn't explain. He stood at the base of the massive hull, looking up at the rusted surface that had once been bright white. For a moment it felt as if he were standing before a monument, something ancient and forgotten by time. He climbed back through the same narrow opening as before, careful not to slip on the damp metal. The air inside was cool and thick with moisture. His flashlight cut through the dimness, showing the same corridor he had walked through yesterday. The walls were streaked with rust and the smell of old wood and metal filled the air. He could hear faint dripping sounds echoing through the ship. It felt both alive and completely silent at the same time. Today he wanted to explore deeper. Yesterday he had seen the dining hall, the upper deck, and the cabins. Now he wanted to find the engine room or the control bridge. Maybe he could find something that told him what had happened here all those years ago. He followed a long hallway that sloped slightly downward. His flashlight beam caught glimpses of broken furniture, scattered papers, and cracked glass. At one point he stopped when he saw a pair of boots lying near a doorway, still neatly placed side by side as if someone had taken them off before leaving. It made his chest tighten a little. This wasn't just an empty structure, it was once someone's world. He turned a corner and found a staircase leading down. The steps were rusty and covered with moss, but they looked strong enough to hold his weight. He descended slowly, one hand gripping the railing. The air grew colder. When he reached the lower level, the smell of oil and dampness hit him stronger. The flashlight beam revealed large pipes running along the walls and a tangle of machinery half buried in debris. He spoke quietly to his camera, his voice low. "This must be the engine room," he said. "Everything's still here. It's just been sleeping." He moved carefully, shining his light over the equipment. Some parts were still recognizable. Control panels, large valves, and an old generator covered in rust. He wiped away some dust from a small plate and read faint letters that said maintenance access. It felt unreal, like walking through a piece of frozen history. In one corner, he found a metal locker, half open. Inside were several small items, a faded jacket, a hard hat, and a notebook wrapped in a torn plastic cover. His heartbeat quickened as he reached for it. The pages were damp but still intact enough to read. He flipped through them slowly. It seemed to be a logbook written by someone who worked in the engine department. The handwriting was rough and slightly smeared from water, but one entry stood out. Flood rising fast. We can't hold position. Captain says we're drifting inland. Never seen anything like this. Daniel read the words again. His hands trembled slightly. The theory he had guessed about a flood was true. He turned another page. Crew evacuated. Engines stopped. No contact with base. We are stuck. God help us. He sat there for a moment, holding the fragile book. It was strange. So many years had passed, yet through this small piece of writing he could almost feel the panic of that moment. He could imagine the crew watching helplessly as the flood carried them away from the waterway, into the forest. He carefully placed the notebook back in its plastic cover and tucked it into his backpack to protect it. Then he turned his camera on himself, speaking softly. I think I found proof of what happened here. It wasn't fake. This ship was stranded by a flood. They couldn't move it afterward. It's incredible, and kind of sad at the same time. He spent another hour filming the lower deck before climbing back up. The higher he went, the more sunlight began to filter in through broken windows. He followed a long hallway until he reached a staircase that spiraled upward. At the top was a heavy door marked Bridge. His pulse quickened. This was where the captain must have commanded the ship. He pushed the door open and it creaked loudly. The bridge was wide, with large windows facing the forest. The glass was dirty and cracked, but the view outside was breathtaking. The sea of green stretching endlessly in every direction. It looked almost unreal, a ship floating on trees instead of water. He walked over to the main console. Dust covered every surface, but the layout was still visible. Old levers, dials, and switches. A compass sat frozen under a layer of grime. He reached out and gently turned it. The needle didn't move. He smiled faintly. Time had stopped here in every sense. Then, on a small wooden desk near the captain's chair, he noticed a leather-bound book. It was larger than the engineer's notebook and covered in mold, but the gold lettering on the front was still readable. Captain's log. Daniel's hands shook a little as he opened it. The first few pages were unreadable, soaked and torn, but as he flipped further, he found clearer writing. The entries described normal voyages, tourist trips along the coast, and then something about a sudden storm. The last few pages were darker, water levels rising fast, engines losing control. We are drifting. No radio contact. I fear we are too far inland. Then the final line. Evacuating. Leaving ship at 6:45 a.m. May God forgive us. Daniel closed the book slowly, his heart heavy. He whispered, they had no idea what was coming. He stood there for a while, looking out the window, imagining the chaos that must have happened during those final moments. The shouting, the rushing water, the fear, and then silence. He felt a strange mix of sadness and admiration for the people who had been here. They had fought the elements and lost, but their story had survived in this forgotten place. He placed the logbook gently back on the desk. He didn't want to disturb it any more than he already had. Then he turned on his camera again and said quietly, this ship was stranded in 1986. The river changed course during the flood, and the Northern Star was left behind. No one ever came to recover it. It's been here ever since, hidden by the forest. As he walked back toward the deck, a soft breeze drifted through the broken windows, carrying the faint smell of rain and earth. The forest outside was alive again, birds calling in the distance. He stepped out onto the deck and took a deep breath. The air felt fresh, almost cleansing after being inside that dark, silent world. He sat down on the edge of the ship and looked out over the trees. For the first time, he allowed himself to really take in what he had done. He had followed a rumor that everyone laughed at, traveled miles through wilderness, and discovered something extraordinary. He wasn't just looking at a wreck. He was looking at a piece of forgotten history. He smiled, thinking about how people online would react when they saw the footage. Most wouldn't believe it at first. Some would say it was CGI or staged. But the ones who paid attention, the ones who felt the same curiosity he did, would know it was real. He stayed there for hours, just sitting in silence, watching the sunlight shift across the metal. It was peaceful, almost spiritual. Then, as the sun began to lower, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faded symbol painted near the hull, partly hidden by vines. He stood and walked closer, brushing the leaves away. It was an emblem of the cruise line that once owned the ship. Below it were faint words, "Bound for new horizons." It made him pause. There was something poetic about it. A ship meant for adventure, now resting forever in the middle of nowhere. He filmed the emblem and said softly, maybe it did find new horizons, just not the ones it expected. That night, back at his camp, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every discovery. The notebooks, the captain's words, the sheer sight of the ship standing alone in the forest. He kept wondering how many people had passed through these woods without ever knowing it was there. He lit a small fire and watched the flames dance. The forest around him hummed with faint sounds, the kind that come only at night. He felt a deep calm settle over him, mixed with a sense of purpose. He knew this was more than just a video project now. It was a story that deserved to be told the right way, with honesty and respect for the people who had been part of it. Before he closed his eyes, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I'll finish filming everything. Then I'll tell the world." The forest grew quiet again, the fire burning low. In the distance, the shadow of the ship stood still against the moonlight, silent and majestic, waiting for its story to be heard once more. The next morning was calm and misty. Thin layers of fog rolled between the trees, giving the forest a quiet, dreamlike feeling. Daniel unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold enough that his breath showed in little clouds. He stretched, then turned toward the direction of the ship. Even though he had spent most of yesterday exploring it, the thought of it still gave him a rush of excitement. It didn't feel like a normal discovery. It felt like the kind of thing that changes how you see the world. He brewed a small cup of coffee over his camp stove, sitting on a rock while the forest slowly woke up. Birds began to call somewhere far off and light started to slip through the fog. He thought about everything he'd found so far. The engineer's log, the captain's notebook, the sight of that giant ship resting silently in the middle of nowhere. It didn't seem real, yet he had proof sitting right inside his backpack. He spent a while planning what to do next. He had filmed most of the exterior and the upper decks, but there were still several areas he hadn't explored yet. Some of the lower cabins, the storage areas, maybe even the control systems buried under the main floors. He also wanted to collect better footage of the ship's condition, close-ups that showed how time and nature had reshaped it. After packing his gear, he started walking back toward the ship. The morning light had grown stronger, cutting through the fog and revealing the towering shape ahead. It looked even larger now, almost blending with the trees that had grown around it. Moss hung down from its sides like long curtains, and the air carried that same faint metallic smell. He reached the base and looked up. The forest around him was completely still, as if holding its breath. He switched on his camera, checking the lens. "Day 3, he said quietly into the microphone. "I'm going to try to explore the lower cabins today. The goal is to understand how much of the ship is still intact, and maybe find more clues about the evacuation." He climbed up the same side he had used before, careful with his footing. Once inside, the air was cool and heavy with dampness. The halls were silent except for the faint sound of water dripping somewhere deep below. Dust hung in the beam of his flashlight. As he moved through the passageways, he noticed details he hadn't before. A painted mural on the wall of a corridor, faded almost to nothing. A broken chandelier hanging sideways in what must have once been a lounge area, and signs in both English and French, their letters barely readable. He stopped often to take short clips, narrating softly. He didn't need to exaggerate anything. The atmosphere spoke for itself. Every step inside this forgotten place told a story. Eventually, he reached a section that seemed untouched compared to the rest. The floor here was dry, and the walls still held some of their original color. He walked slowly, shining his light into open doors. Inside one cabin, he found a suitcase lying under a pile of debris. He brushed off the dust and tried to open it. The zipper was stuck, but after some effort, it gave way. Inside were a few old clothes, neatly folded, and a small photo album wrapped in plastic. He sat down on the floor and flipped it open. The pictures were faded, but he could still see smiling faces. Families, children standing on the deck, people dressed in summer clothes enjoying what must have been a vacation cruise. He looked through the pages quietly. There was something strangely moving about it. These weren't famous explorers or adventurers. They were ordinary people just like anyone else who had once been here when everything was alive and full of laughter. Then one day everything changed and this ship became a ghost in the woods. He spoke softly into his camera. You can almost feel their presence here. This ship isn't just metal and wood, it's full of stories that were never finished. He placed the album carefully back where he found it. A while later, he made his way to what appeared to be a staff area. There were signs pointing toward a storage deck. He followed them, descending a narrow staircase that groaned under his boots. The air grew cooler again and the smell of old oil returned. The flashlight flickered over rows of old crates and barrels, some still sealed. He noticed a strange sound, a low hum, faint and rhythmic. It wasn't mechanical. It was just the wind moving through broken pipes, but for a second it made his heart race. The silence inside the ship made every little sound feel louder, alive. He took another deep breath and kept going. Toward the back of the deck, he found what looked like a small control panel covered in grime. Above it hung a map of the ship's layout. He wiped the surface and took a photo. It showed every level, the cabins, the kitchen, the storage, and at the very top the bridge he had already explored. He traced the lines with his finger, trying to understand how far he had gone and how much was still hidden. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, something falling from a shelf behind him. He turned quickly, flashlight raised only to see a small bird flutter away through a broken vent. He exhaled sharply and laughed at himself. "All right," he said quietly. "Nature's still the only thing living here." He climbed back up to the main floor where sunlight now poured through the cracks in the walls. The air felt lighter. He sat near one of the broken windows and ate a quick snack, looking out at the forest again. From that spot, he could see the treetops stretching endlessly, the same view the captain might have seen decades ago before everything went wrong. He turned his camera back on, speaking calmly. "It's strange," he said. "When I first came here, I thought this place would feel creepy or haunted. But it doesn't. It feels calm, peaceful, like the ship found a new home instead of being lost." He stayed quiet for a few minutes, listening to the soft sounds of the forest drifting in. Later in the afternoon, he decided to take drone footage from above. He climbed to the top deck again and launched it, watching on his phone screen as the drone rose higher. The view that appeared made him gasp softly. From the air, the ship looked like a sleeping giant surrounded by an ocean of trees. You could see how the river might have once flowed nearby, now just a thin line of dry earth cutting through the forest. He guided the drone around the perimeter, capturing the full length of the ship. Every frame looked surreal. He imagined what the crew must have felt as the floodwaters carried them this far inland. When the drone finally returned, he caught it gently and smiled. "That's going in the final video for sure," he said under his breath. As evening approached, he began packing his equipment. He had enough footage and material to build the full story now. Before leaving, he took one last slow walk through the ship. His flashlight moved over the cracked walls, the railings, the doorways that led to nowhere. He whispered a quiet thank you to the ship, to the people who had once been there, and to the strange chance that had brought him here. When he stepped outside, the light had turned golden again. The forest glowed softly and the air was still. He turned back one last time and looked at the northern star. The name on its side was almost invisible now, swallowed by rust and vines. Yet in the fading light it looked almost alive, as if it had been waiting for someone to remember it. That night he built a small fire near his camp and sat close to it, holding his camera. He reviewed bits of his footage, watching his own voice narrate the story as the images flickered across the small screen. The ship looked magnificent even through the lens. He spoke softly to the camera, recording his thoughts. "You know, sometimes we spend our lives chasing the big mysteries, UFOs, lost cities, things that sound impossible. But sometimes the real wonders are right here on Earth, hidden in plain sight. A ship lost in the forest, a story buried under silence. I think the world needs to see this, not as a legend, but as proof of how strange and beautiful life can be." He turned off the camera and sat quietly, staring into the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had done what he came for. Tomorrow he would start his journey back to civilization and share what he found. As the night deepened, the forest hummed with soft sounds, the wind brushing through leaves. Insects calling, and somewhere in the distance, the faint creak of the ship settling in the cool air. It didn't sound eerie anymore. It sounded alive, as if the northern star was breathing softly, content to finally have its story heard again. Daniel smiled faintly, whispered, "You were never forgotten," and let the fire burn low as the stars slowly filled the sky.